Again, the question of beds and girls somehow arose by itself. In addition to all the troubles, many factories did not work. There were 200,000 unemployed, and these data are considered underestimated. Railway workers began to strike everywhere. Back in May, the Austrians, desperately looking for some way out, appointed General Kraus as dictator of Ukraine, that is, of their occupation zone, and instructed him to restore order with the harshest measures. However, this interesting innovation was quickly stopped by the Germans, exerting the strongest diplomatic pressure on Vienna, again so that the younger sister would not increase excessively. The Austrians did not calm down, intending to turn the Odessa and Kherson regions into their colony, and if they were lucky, then the whole of southern Ukraine. The Germans thwarted that too. However, the Austrians were extremely stubborn. Closer to autumn, a new idea was put forward, to make the young Archduke Wilhelm von Habsburg the hetman, or even the king of the Ukrainian kingdom, in which they were warmly supported by a group of Ukrainian politicians from Odessa. There was no need to send for the Archduke to Vienna. He stayed here in Ukraine, served as an officer in the Ukrainian Legion, consisting of Galician Sistrelci. He spoke Ukrainian quite well. All this does not look like a cheap operetta at all. Wilhelm was quite popular both in the Legion and in the Zaporozhye division, so he could count on a considerable number of bayonets. In the end, in May of 1918th year, the Archduke was made a direct offer to take the Ukrainian throne. Wilhelm considered the offer seriously for a while. On the one hand, he had no career opportunities at home in Vienna. Charles, who became emperor, is barely 30-something. His wife is even younger. They have already had 4 boys. So Wilhelm's throne did not shine in any way. On the other hand, Wilhelm was well aware that the Germans would lay down their bones, but they would not allow him to the Ukrainian throne, and refused. Emperor Charles approved of his act, but clearly did not abandon this idea, recommending the Archduke to continue to maintain friendly relations with Ukrainians. Just in case. You never know how it can turn out. The Germans, who were supposedly unperturbed, were in fact seriously concerned and, together with some Austrian dignitaries holding them aside, tried to push the Archduke and the Legion to the front, quite possibly hoping that he would be killed there and the problem would resolve itself. Wilhelm was openly twisting. He went to Germany and met with the Kaiser there to dispel the unfounded accusations and rumors that his stay in Ukraine had generated. However, after that, he returned to Ukraine, where he quietly continued to serve. Skoropadsky quietly hated him and did not want to meet him. The Germans increased the pressure on Vienna. Only at the beginning of October 1918th year, it was possible to get rid of the Archduke by transferring the entire Ukrainian Legion outside the state to eastern Galicia. In parallel, the Germans and the Austrians took all measures to ensure that the hetman's army did not strengthen excessively, remained small and weak, or else he would want to get rid of Berlin's Viennese benefactors. It remains unknown whether the occupiers had plans to replace Skoropadsky, who frankly did not pull on anyone else. If there were, they were not destined to be realized. Revolutions broke out almost simultaneously both in Germany and in Austria-Hungary. Very quickly it started from pitch black. Both the German Kaiser and the Austrian Emperor, aka King Charles of Hungary, lost their thrones. In Germany, the warring parties quickly organized their armed formations and began to fight among themselves in earnest. Interestingly, a young corporal with 2 iron crosses, named Adolf Hitler, was in service in one of the Red units. In Austria-Hungary, the situation was still complicated. Not only did it crumble very quickly into several nation-states, but a real civil war began there. But not by interpersonal political groupings, as in Germany, but by villages with a city. That's right, Austria was clearly divided into 2 districts. Vienna, with the surrounding lands, where industry and accordingly, the working class, and the rest of the population concentrated, purely agricultural. The Social Democrats came to power, who in no country, once at the helm, did anything worthwhile. In the industrial part of the country, There were a lot of workers' councils, in no way about Bolshevik, but in the agrarian one. A lot of peasant councils. Most of the factories became, because they worked exclusively for the war, and who needed planes and cannons, shells and machine guns now. Since no one could offer any goods of interest to the peasants, they simply were not produced. The workers and their families were seriously faced with the prospect of starvation. And then, by the decision of the workers' councils, food detachments moved to the village. Without the slightest ideological background, I simply wanted to save my wife's children from starvation. Rode all the food under the broom. And since the people were different, they took everything that was not nailed or screwed. The peasant Soviets announced a general mobilization. There were plenty of weapons, as in Russia. Deserters who left the collapsed front brought a lot of them with them. The real fights began. There were a lot of warring people on both sides, so the case was familiar. It got to the point that other Austrian regions were seriously going to proclaim independence and sovereignty, hoping that only in this way it would be possible to get out of the crisis. All this was watched with great interest by the neighbors, the newborn Poland, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, seriously preparing, in the event of the final collapse of Austria, to tear what they could from it. And it was called, you will laugh, the October Revolution, which is written about by none other than the leader of the Austrian Mensheviks, Otto Bauer, who headed the government at one time. German and Austro-Hungarian troops began to evacuate to their fatherlands. Everyone was not up to the hetman. A fat polar fox appeared nearby. The hetman, who saw her, abruptly changed course. He urgently put together a new cabinet of ministers, already without a single independent member, and proclaimed an act of federation, according to which he pledged to reunite Ukraine with a future non-Bolshevik Russia, thereby hoping to receive the support of Denikin and accordingly, the Entente. I hoped in vain. Everything else happened according to Vysotsky's song, and at this time Bonaparte was crossing the border. As a matter of fact, this Bonaparte did not cross any border, but settled here, nearby, in the city of Biela Tserkva. Bonaparte was, frankly, of the second freshness, but he had downright Napoleonic plans. Meet Simon, until his youth, just Semyon, Petliura. Hailing from the Poltava Philistines, just like Stalin, he was expelled from the Poltava Theological Seminary, until the end of the full course. This is where any resemblance to Stalin ends, given the subsequent biographies of both, for unreliability, predilection for reading illegal literature, revolutionary Ukrainophile sentiments. It was at the seminary that Semyon renamed himself Simon, as other researchers suggest, in honor of the famous Latin-American figure Simon Bolivar, who fought for independence from Spain, created several states. At the beginning of 1900 and first year, he fell under constant police surveillance. And soon, where it should be, there was a daddy called Observations, for an inquiry about the nationalist Poltava group of the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party in the Poltava Theological Seminary. Petliura and his equally young friends actually created an organization called the Up-Ukrainian Revolutionary Party. Despite the formidable name, this party was by nature quite moderate, not independence, but only the autonomy of Ukraine as part of the empire, constitution and democracy, freedom and equality, land redistribution. There is no bias towards rabid nationalism, a la Grushevsky. In general, it was a fairly harmless organization, engaged mainly in cultural and educational work. However, the authorities in those rebellious times made a stand on the very word revolutionary, like a dog on a game. Arrests began. Exiled in the summer of 1901 and the seminary, Petliura, along with several party colleagues, moved away from Sindh to the Kuban, where members of the RUB engaged in illegal activities for which Petliura served a month in prison in 1904. Before the trial, he was, according to the rules of that time, released on bail. The father sold his tithe of the forest and contributed money. But he did not wait for the trial, and together with one of his associates, he moved to Austria-Hungary, to Galicia. By that time, the RUB had broken up into several tiny factions, and it was decided to create an Ostrp instead. The Ukrainian Social Democratic Workers' Party, where Petliura became a member of the Central Committee. The party's program was quite Marxist, but of a Menshevik, not a Bolshevik kind. Again, there was no question of independence, only about the autonomy of Ukraine with its own parliament, which would have the right to issue laws. He communicated closely with Hrushevsky, on whose recommendation he began working in one of the Ukrainophile newspapers. In 1908, when the revolutionary movement began to decline everywhere, and a period of peculiar stagnation began, Petliura, as not so many people did, somehow moved away from active illegal activity. He worked as an accountant, wrote to newspapers, started some household in Minsk, got married, got a child. During the First World War, he did not stay as an orderly for long, but soon good friends found a warmer place in the mountain Union of Zemstvos and Cities. This organization was engaged in supplying the front, and it was by no means a gathering of angels. There, government money was sawed off, and those who wanted to dodge the front were attached there. For their paramilitary uniforms, they were ironically called Zemgusars and treated with little respect. Well, there's February. Petliura not only returned to politics, she found him herself. At the end of March of the 17th, the Little Russians of the Western Front chose Simon as the head of the Ukrainian Military Revolutionary Committee of the said front. And he plunged headlong into his former activities, but now quite legally. In the Central Rada, he became Minister of War. This position was called differently, but the essence was exactly like that. However, already in December of the 17th, he was dismissed on suspicion of preparing a coup, right-wing bias, and officer sympathies. The first two charges are fictitious, but as for the third, Petliura is not a Russophobe from any side, and in fact maintained close ties with the great Russian officers. He tried to attract part of it to the side of the Rada and allowed the free departure of armed Cossacks, officers, Junkers from Ukraine to Kornilev and Kalydin. Reliable witnesses said that, at the end of the 17th, Petliura was going to break with Bolshevism. Vinichenko, one of Grushevsky's closest associates, a left-wing socialist, and with Grushevsky's Astrophilism, claimed to have only two enemies: Germans and Bolsheviks, and only one friend: Russia. The retired minister, not by his own will, but in general, with the consent of the Rada, began to form new military units, the so-called Gatamad Skin, which gradually turned into a fairly large military unit by those standards. With her, Petliura suppressed the Bolshevik uprising in Kiev, drove Muravyev's Red troops away from the city. In the end, the members of the Rada, led by Svinichenko, who intrigued against Petliura, they fought there like dogs over a bone, removed him from the command of the Gatamaks, and Petliura completely went into journalism. And then, after persuasion, he took a completely new post, the head of the Kiev Provincial Zemstvo, that is, he headed schools, hospitals, outpatient clinics, and seminaries. Seminaries were not only spiritual, but also secular, training mainly teachers. Then the invaders appeared, and put Hetman Skoropadsky at the head of the state. At first, Petliura's relationship with him was quite normal. The hetman himself said that his political beliefs are not extreme, so much so that it even occurred to me to involve him in the government. And he complained only about Petliura's excessive involvement with the socialist parties. However, the subsequent events are extremely reminiscent of the story of the scientist Dr. Budok from the Strugatsky novel, which has been quoted more than once. The Duke and Rakansky wanted to give him the nobility, but changed his mind and decided to put him in the tower. The relationship soured. Petliura began to publicly criticize the hetman for repressions against peasants and other sins. The Zemstvos became the legal center of opposition to Skoropadsky. The rightists, surrounded by the hetman, demanded to send Petliura to jail, accusing him of preparing a coup. The accusations, I must say, were not fictitious. Even when Hetman Petliura came, he planned to overthrow him, but he did not gather enough forces. And now he began to maintain secret ties with a deeply secret organization of hetman's officers, who had previously served in the troops of the Central Rada. The Germans demanded the same thing, for Petliura's contacts with representatives of the Entente, which really took place. Petliura spent 3.5 months in prison, then was released. When the occupiers began to leave Ukraine, and the hetman was desperately rushing around, trying to find some new course that would help him stay in power. Meanwhile, the opposition has created a parallel government, the Directory. One of its main figures was the unsinkable Vinichenko, who, after the fall of Hrushevsky, calmly collaborated with the hetman, and now decided to end it with him. Petliura was not invited there at first. Vinichenko didn't like him very much, but the Sitstreltsy intervened, and in an ultimatum demanded that Simon be appointed not just a member of the Directory, the head ataman, that is, the commander-in-chief. The Directory reluctantly agreed. Petliura was popular in the troops as a defender of Kiev from the Reds, an opponent of the invocation of the occupiers to Ukraine, a zemstvo figure, an open enemy of the hetman, and, finally, a prison settles who suffered for the idea. As the supreme commander of Petliura, he launched an offensive against Kiev, which he occupied almost without a fight. Even before that, part of the hetman's army went over to Petliura's side, and some simply ran away to wherever. Petliura had quite considerable forces. In addition, peasants came to him en masse. About the reasons a little later. So the change of power took place almost bloodlessly, as he later told in his memoirs somewhere. In emigration, it became a real craze to write memoirs. Everyone wrote. Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich and just Prince Felix Yusupov, White Guard generals and officers, prominent politicians Milyakov and Chernov, Kerensky, the famous socialist Angelika Balabanova, at one time Mussolini's mistress, also a socialist with experience, Rasputin's daughter, and a lot of people. Nestor Makhno announced that he would publish his memoirs in 10 volumes, but he managed to write only 4. Then he died, either from overwork or just the deadline has come. The former hetman did not escape this fashionable craze either. In his memoirs, he describes in detail his hopeless situation. Commandant Przovsky came to me and asked for permission to release a small part of a separate division guarding me, to rescue the division itself, which was disarmed at night. I went out to the entrance, talked to this platoon and let him go. Scandal, I had nothing else left. The information became more and more alarming. Finally, I received a notification that the arsenal had been taken, that the war ministry was occupied, therefore, the rebels were already not far from our quarter. Once upon a time, the locals who hated him said about the Siberian Khan Kukum defeated by Ermak's Cossacks. His entire Khanate fits under the hooves of his horse. So it was with Skoropadsky. All his hetmanate fit under the soles of his boots. Already left completely alone, he wandered through the streets of Kiev to the apartment of his adjutant Dankovsky, where he was going to sit out waiting for something incomprehensible. However, very quickly, Dankovsky persuaded him to leave, threatening that his landlords would quickly hand over the hetman as the winner. Most likely, Dankovsky was primarily afraid for his own skin. Skoropadsky went to the Turkish envoy Ahmed Mukhtarbayev. The Turkish embassy occupied as many as 2 rooms in the Palace Hotel. I realized that everything was gone. I had a heavy heart. I was thinking whether I should give up power after all or not. But not a comedian. He had no power, sheltered in a corner of one of the hotel rooms. After thinking about it, he wrote the abnegation, and the Germans generously gave him a place on one of their trains. However, Skoropadsky doesn't mention a word about how it happened for some reason. In the film adaptation of Bulgakov's White Guard, the hetman's flight is depicted perhaps in an extremely unsightly way for Skoropadsky. At the last moment, the Germans wrapped his face with bandages, gave him a soldier's overcoat, and the homeless fugitive rolled into the unknown with empty pockets. In fact, everything happened differently. According to reliable sources, the hetman, who by no means chewed a dry crust in emigration, took a lot of good to Germany: gold, pebbles, paintings by old masters, and other valuables. He had plenty of goodness. The Trostenets burned down by the peasants was far from the hetman's only estate. So there were some preliminary agreements with the Germans. Places for luggage, a lot of work on the transportation of belongings, which required the time and effort of not a single person. However, as already mentioned, the hetman carefully avoided any details of his departure to Germany. And this is not for nothing. Defaming his memoirs is just funny. Trying to whitewash himself as much as possible, the former hetman chose not the smartest way. He writes, actually, he had grandiose plans and brilliant ideas, but he got some kind of wrong people, did not appreciate the plans, did not rush to implement the ideas, but rebelled to the fullest. Something like this. Those who wish can familiarize themselves with this reading by finding the Smirnov Project Ukraine book indicated in the bibliography. From Smirnov, there is only a preface, and the whole book is Skoropadsky's memoirs. In Kiev, he sat down on the kingdom of Petliura, the chosen head of the Directory. In Ukraine, he lasted a little over a year. From the point of view of the present time, it should certainly be recognized that Soviet propaganda has poured too much black paint on Petliura, and she is not the only one. Petliura in reality was not such a bloody monster as he was portrayed. In some ways, let's face it, the person is quite decent. Not a Russophobe, not an anti-Semite, not a leftist or a rightist, but rather a moderate, in some ways an outspoken idealist. However, this does not mean that he should be treated with sympathy. Simply not for anything. And in general, idealists on the throne, no matter how the throne was called, always ended badly. Petliura turned out to be fantastically unlucky. As the Strugatskys wrote in the more than once mentioned novel about one of their heroes, so that he did not plan, everything failed. Under Petliura, Ukraine turned out to be such a cheerful mess, which perhaps was not even under the Central Rada and the hetman. Everyone fought with Petliura, and the Poles at first, and the Reds, and the Whites, and Father Makhno after a short union, and numerous Atamans with a vague political orientation, or even without one at all. Riots broke out everywhere, then soldiers, then townspeople, then peasants. Even a modern biographer, who treats Petliura with great reverence, was forced to admit, in general, the internal history of the Directory can be considered as a detective story. A continuous series of conspiracies, rebellions and their suppression. Petliura was cleaned with the last words from all sides. Denikin called him a bandit and a traitor. The Entente country was in no hurry to recognize the Directory, considering its leaders Bolsheviks and Germanophiles, which in general does not correspond to the truth. And the black humor is that at the same time, the Bolsheviks accused Petliura of collaborating with the Entente, calling the directors bourgeois henchmen and enemies of the proletariat. Makhno, who had serious propagandists, mainly from the social revolutionaries, even during the short-lived Union, published a pamphlet Who is Petliura?, where the head of the Directory was accused of being bourgeois and selling Ukraine to French and English capitalists. The Ukrainian politician Marko Tun, so that he could attribute to Petliura the fact that he allegedly secretly pursues the policy of Germany and the Vatican. In a word, wherever you throw, there is a wedge everywhere, where to solve land issues and other serious matters in such conditions, there was only enough strength to fight off an external enemy and an internal adversary with a sin in half. There was no talk of any organized apparatus of power. Plots against Petliura were arranged by both the left and the right. There was a time when Denikin's people kicked Petliura out of Kiev, and the government and its head were placed on a train traveling through a miserable piece of former possessions. It was then that the mocking Chastushka was born under the car. The territory and the Directory is in the car. The social democrat and writer Vinichenko mockingly comments on the situation. A man with no special moral principles, he was Grushevsky's deputy, but after his fall, he passed to the hetman without much torment, Petliura's enemy, but he wrote the situation without any exaggerations. A carriage existence has come, wandering around the stations in a small place, without shelter, disorder, without troops, without territory, and with enemies from all sides. There were moments when, under the rule of the Ukrainian Ataman socialist government, there were only a few versts of the railway occupied by government cars, in which governments, parties, officials and troops lived. Something like a gypsy camp. The Directory lives in cars, around which there are mountains of sewage, garbage, dirt. Ministers swear, quarrel, complain, arrest each other. There are no troops, only one headquarters, and atamans, led by the head ataman Ballerino. However, Several times Petliura still managed to regain the lost territories and create more or less combat-ready military units. His only foreign policy success was his alliance with the Czar. The West Ukrainian People's Republic, in the context of a general parade of sovereignties, created in Galicia. However, the Poles explained this to the Republic very quickly. Poland has officially declared that it intends to revive the borders of 1772nd year. From Mosa to Mosa, the troops of the Republic of the Ukrainian Galician Army of the Yuga retreated to the territory controlled by Petliura. But then, she shook this army in a uniform way, like a drunken combine harvester down a village street. Judge for yourself. Once at Petliura, the Yuga fought first with both the Red Army and the Denikins. Then she moved on to Denikin. After the defeat of the Whites in the south and the occupation of the Crimea by the Reds, part of the Yuga began to fight on the side of the Reds against the Poles, and part on the side of the Poles against the Reds. One of the divisions, which was clearly dominated by completely finished pessimists, did not fight for anyone, but went to Transcarpathia, where the Czechs interned this army. A bizarre odyssey came out. In the end, the Red Army finally kicked Petliura out of Ukraine, and he fled to Warsaw, where he concluded a joint activity agreement with Marshal Pilsudski. The cunning Litvan Pilsudski, taking advantage of the position of an ally, stripped him like a stick. Petliura renounced all claims to Galicia in favor of Poland, as well as any support for the Czar, transferred the right bank to Poland, and put the 3 remaining divisions under the underground command. In response, Pilsudski generously recognized Petliura as the legitimate head of the left bank. How I felt in the hands of the Bolsheviks. Poles, in the company of a certain number of Petliurists, invaded Ukraine, briefly captured Kiev, but the Red Army kicked them out of there. Petliura's soldiers ended up in Polish internment camps. Not a concentration camp, but not a resort either. For a while Petliura was still floundering. However, no one took him seriously anymore. He was simply not allowed to negotiate between Poland and Soviet Russia. The Bolsheviks categorically refused to consider it a high contracting party, and the Poles did not protest. The head Ataman was still trying to do something. He sent rebel detachments to Soviet Ukraine, and tried to establish a widely branched underground there to prepare for a general uprising. But the Red Army broke up these detachments, and the GRU of underground workers qualitatively defeated. Petliura began to bombard Warsaw with diplomatic notes. Protested against the mistreatment of Poles with Ukrainians in the territories inherited by Poland under the peace treaty of Galicia and Western Volhynia, demanded to share property for the maintenance of his army, which the Poles looted a lot in Ukraine. As probably all sorts of Poles in their place ignored these messages. And there, Petliura remained a general, without an army at all. The remnants of his troops fled from the Polish camps. Blagopolyaks were not hindered all over Europe to earn a living. In Poland, Petliura finally got sick. The national government remained with him, because there was simply nowhere to go. But there are no real forces left. In addition, Pan Simon was seriously afraid that the Poles, not seeing any more use from him, would give him up to the Bolsheviks, which Moscow insistently demanded from Warsaw. On December 31, 1923, Petliura left for Budapest, where the Hungarians, the only ones in Europe by that time, for some reason of their own, recognized at the governmental level the mission of the disappeared Ukrainian People's Republic there. However, it got worse there too. There were practically no Ukrainian immigrants in Hungary. Moreover, Hungary began to secretly contact the USSR on the basis of territorial claims of both countries to Romania, and in the thirst for revision of post-war borders. The Hungarians announced that they no longer recognized the mission of the Upper, and Petliura moved to Paris, where, calling things by their proper names, he dragged a miserable creature. The French authorities completely neglected him. France just supported Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, which seized part of the Ukrainian lands. The Ukrainian emigration in France, of several tens of thousands of people, split into many parties, so that Petliura could count on at most thousands on 3 sides.